The Cold War was fought on many fronts: nuclear stockpiles, political alliances, propaganda machines, and some of its most decisive battles took place in the global economy. Even as superpowers pointed missiles at one another, they also wielded another, less visible weapon: financial power. Restrictive trade practices, economic assistance, and political sanctions became effective levers of influence over other nations and reshaped world order. Americans and Soviets no longer compete for the moon or the battlefield. They compete to control markets, resources, and financial systems. Economic warfare has proved just as potent as military warfare, and this time around, countries have been given a choice, not between a weapon, but a trade agreement or financial dependence. But did these tactics win the Cold War? Could economic pressure unseat a superpower better than military conflict? And in a world still under sanctions and trade wars, have we ever truly left the economic battlefield behind? Europe lay in ruins after the end of World War II, the economies shattered, the infrastructure destroyed. The United States may see a window of opportunity here, not only for humanitarian rescue, but also for the exercise of influence. Step in, then, the Marshall Plan. A colossal 1948 recovery program that plugged over $13 billion into war-torn Western Europe. Goals: rebuild the economy, strengthen democracies, and most importantly, stem the tide in nations that couldn't keep on their feet of falling into Soviet orbit. Countries that accepted the United States aid aligned themselves with the West, thereby widening the two blocs created by the capitalist versus communist bloc. This threat was directly to Soviet influence. To counter this, it started the Molotov Plan, followed by COMECON, Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, providing economic assistance to the Eastern Bloc states. Unlike the Marshall Plan, which was a market-driven growth program, Soviet aid focused on centralized planning and resource sharing among socialist states. Instead of prosperity, many economies in Eastern Europe became dependent upon Moscow, crippled in modernizing activities. For years, the search for economic superiority defined the world's leading alliances. And while Western Europe thrived with investment from America, capitalism succeeded, and in the East, Moscow held all the cards through planned economies. The economic division had ignited the cold. After World War II, Europe was in tatters. Its economies had collapsed and much of its infrastructure had been destroyed. This destruction left a power vacuum, and the US and the Soviet Union hastened to fill it, not with troops, but with money. In 1948, the US started the Marshall Plan, a $13 billion plan aimed at getting war-torn Western Europe's economy back on track. It was not a mere economic succor, but also a strategic initiative to ensure no weak nation slid into communism again. It fostered the growth of industries, hence stabilizing economies, and, most importantly, solidified political bonds by putting the power of capitalism deep down in Western Europe. The states that were controlled by US aid, such as France, West Germany, and Italy, pretty soon regained their stability and fell into the ranks of the camp of the West. The Soviet Union viewed the Marshall Plan as an attempt to dismantle their control in Eastern Europe. They responded by producing the Molotov Plan and eventually COMECON, or the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance. State-managed economies would be emphasized in US aid. The Soviets stressed raw materials, trade agreements, and industrial investment in communist nations such as Poland, East Germany, and Czechoslovakia. Instead of allowing the Eastern Bloc states to attain economic independence, it bound them almost totally to Moscow and kept them aligned with Soviet ideology. This economic competition made the gap between East and West even wider. While Western Europe flourished on capitalist investment, Eastern economies limped under Soviet control. The battle of economic supremacy would not only define allegiances, but also pave the way for decades of Cold War tensions, as financial strength turned out to be as potent as a military force. Military spending was locked into an escalating war between the two superpowers. with enormous money stockpiling in both cases for nuclear arsenals and advanced munitions, and a defensive build-up on each side due to an understandable fear that an apparent weakness might flip the balance of power. The US put heavy commitments in place for its programs in SDI, which called forth responses from the Soviet Union to develop its military-industrial complex. This bidding turned the game of nuclear deterrence into a bottomless pit of costs. The economic costs of the arms race were phenomenal. The US, with its capitalist economy, could maintain the high spending on the military while the economy continued to grow rapidly. The case was quite different for the Soviet Union, which had a centralized planned economy. The USSR invested tremendous amounts of resources in defense expenditure while foregoing consumer goods, infrastructure, and social programs. The citizenry had to endure the brunt of shortages even of the most elementary necessities, while budgets were becoming unsustainable for governments. Military competition in the Cold War had drained the Soviet economy by the 1980s. The USSR could neither compete on a par with the technological superiority of the West, nor improve the efficacy and stalling economic performance of its system. The US heightened the pressure further with increased expenditure under President Reagan on the defense sector, adding on an arms build-up pressure that the Soviets simply could not reciprocate. This unrelenting military rivalry proved to be one of the significant economic costs that brought down the Soviet Union. Well into the late 1980s, when the economic crisis deepened and attempts at reform continued to fail, fissures in the Soviet system were far too big to be ignored. As it happens, the USSR did indeed break up in the year 1991. It was only then that it became clear that economic strain due to the arms race pushed it to its final tragic conclusion, showing that an economic war could be as disastrous as real. War-energy resources, especially oil, were the most important factor in the economic power struggle of the Cold War. The United States and USSR started to take care of their interest overseas, which needed access to rich oil reserves, and the Middle East was an influential region, primarily because of their oil reserves in the region, as both the great powers tried to gain favor with them. The United States utilized political and economic pressures to align itself with oil-producing countries such as Saudi Arabia, thus achieving the highest place in the world's oil market. The Soviets, on the other hand, tried to outmaneuver by establishing ties with countries in Africa and Asia that possessed natural resources. Trade blocs had a significant presence in the Cold War economic competition. The USSR aimed to construct a socialist society founded on bodies like COMECON, or the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance Organization, that encourages regional economic integration against the US-led global capitalist system. Meanwhile, the US used institutions like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, IMF, to extend its economic reach, particularly in the Western Hemisphere. Moreover, proxy conflicts in resource-rich regions like Africa and Latin America became battlegrounds for economic control. Nations rich in resources such as the Congo, Angola, and the rest fall into the basket of Cold War politics, where all forms of economic or military aid come as a string attached. Globalization through economics and world policy. During the Cold War years, put some economic policy trends on the map. This brought globalization into their orbit that is keen to rope more countries for influencing the existing form of trading as it takes shape today in this world. This is a threat, since these countries will not be drawn in further by US capitalism and free market ideology toward the Soviet socialist model, but will instead have their trade developed under state-controlled industry. Traditions of these types of economic strategies can be traced back up until modern trade agreements and international financial systems. Most visible of the developments of Cold War economies is the increasing power of the superpower state of China in terms of influence over world economies. During the time of the Cold War, the country was a very important ally to the USSR, starting with China turning its back around towards capitalism. After 1980, the Chinese economy began to shoot up drastically, what was pointed toward during the phase of Cold War economics was a technological advancement in industrial capacities. Cut forward to today. It now appears to be in a new type of economic Cold War. From all indications, the world is transiting to an era with the US and China locked in hard economic rivalry, whereby trade wars, tariffs and sanctions have adopted Cold War patterns. As such, economic leverage emerges as a weapon to dominate globally, and countries are getting polarized with their economic allies just like during the previous rivalry. This is a purse battle that could still go on for a very long time since, while the Cold War may have been won, the battle for power over the economy hasn't ended. The Cold War was not a mere battle of missiles and military power, but was also a battle of economic influence. From the Marshall Plan to Soviet aid programs, both the superpowers attempted to use their financial strategies for the formation of global alliances to shape their supremacy. The US rebuilt Europe perfectly and sealed it as its area of influence, while the USSR could hardly pay a hefty price on its economic fronts, which sometimes became unsustainable. The whole Cold War did not end with who had the biggest arsenal in the question. The final stretch ended in outlasting who drained the economy the most. Economic warfare changed the outcome of the Cold War. The balance shifted elsewhere, and we need to think about today's economic conflicts back into this global power struggle. The Cold War will most likely be remembered by most of its victims as a period of tension and division. But what does one do when the old power struggles start to crack under the weight of time? The question remains, when do the financial front lines begin to show signs of fracture?